I need you to trust me because I'm a novice. What's up, everybody, and welcome to episode 25 of Trust Me, I'm a Novice. I'm your host, Sammi St. Ledger, and this is the podcast about connections. We are talking science, psychology, spirituality, and about ourselves. Last week, I had the opportunity of talking to a dear friend, Luke Emano, who is studying abroad in London right now. So if you have not seen that episode, go ahead, click the link right now and check it out. That being said, today's topic is abortion, and it's a very obviously heated and passionate topic. It is all over the news, and it has now made its way into our households. I wanted to bring it on the podcast today because I believe it encompasses all aspects of connections, even past the psych, science, spirituality, and self that we're always talking about. Abortion is quite the buzzword right now, and it is quite the heated argument. So before we get into this today, I want to give a disclaimer that I am not here to tell you what to think. I am not here to tell you what to believe. I am merely here to present tools to give you more power within your conversations. Trust Me, I'm a Novice is a podcast heavily based in self-empowerment, and I want everybody listening today to feel empowered to be able to be involved in conversations as well as make choices in the future. That being said, when I think about the US, and I've talked about it before, the United States is supposedly founded on freedom. It's something a lot of people preach. It's something a lot of people are very big on. But in my opinion, I don't believe we are free to make our own choices if we are not fully educated on the choice itself. So with that said, today we are breaking down a lot of different aspects of abortion, and more specifically, starting off with digging into the history of it. Trust me, trust yourself, and trust the process because we are getting things started. All right, starting off the conversation today. Abortion is often divided into two different sets of beliefs. We are quite the bipartisan country. We're usually on one side or the other, even though that's not necessarily what has to be for anybody. It's simply what's happened over time. And abortion, it often moves into pro-choice, which means someone is pro about someone choosing whether or not they decide to get an abortion, or pro-life, which is often the belief, that people should not be able to terminate pregnancies. And when I think about growing up, and when I think about certain things that I was exposed to over the years, I remember growing up and hearing this actually from my sister, but also from other people, that when I was first presented with the idea of what an abortion was, I was probably, I want to say 8, 10, right around that area. And the person that presented it to me had a pro-life mindset and said, it's killing babies. And that was the one way it was phrased, just abortion is killing babies. So at the age of, 8, I was like, oh my God. Like, oh, how could you kill a baby? And right away, I had this really emotional response because hearing it phrased like that clearly makes it seem like something that is wrong. Why would you kill a child? Of course. So I'll start off before digging in today that I think it is a very logical conclusion that a lot of people come to at some point in their lives. However, I do believe that as we grow and change, we can begin to see different ways of thinking about a situation. So, moving forward, we are actually bringing back, pardon the pun, an author that I love. I talked about New York Times best-selling author Glennon Doyle in episode 13, Making Decisions 101, Let It Burn. Now, Glennon is an author. Like I said, she's very acclaimed. And on top of this, she was raised Christian. She is openly queer. She does a lot with humanitarian efforts, and she's really big on helping women and children globally. And she wrote a book that we talked about before called Untamed, which was her experience more or less deprogramming a lot of what she's learned over the years from every single space, far past just religion, far past education, every different area of her life. She talks about becoming who deep down she knows she is. And One of Glennon's chapters in Untamed tackles the concept of abortion and what she has learned about it within its relation to Christianity. And what I will say with that is Glennon is still a super spiritual person. I believe she can bring a very unique perspective to the conversation because she also is open about her feelings towards things that are not always supported within those institutions. So we're going to start off with a book. If you're listening, I'm starting off with a book. If you're watching, you can see the book. But this chapter is called Decals, and we are going to dig into it right now. Glennon writes, quote, "When I was a young mother, exhausted, isolating, and dripping with children, I got a postcard from a local church offering free babysitting during the service. My then husband and I attended the following Sunday and found coffee, breakfast, music, a nursery, inspiring speakers, and welcoming couples everywhere. This church had identified every challenge in a young family's life and fixed them all for an hour. It felt like heaven at first. Then one Sunday, the preacher started discussing the sins of homosexuality and abortion as if they were pillars upon which this church was built. My insides caught fire. After the service, I contacted the preacher and set up a meeting. I asked him, quote, why, if your church is based on Jesus, who spoke incessantly about orphans and widows, demilitarization, immigrants, the sick, the outcast, and the poor, are you choosing abortion and gayness to hang your hat upon? End quote. Glennon continues to write, saying, quote, after many circular arguments, he looked at me, sighed, and smiled. He said, quote, you're a smart woman, end quote. What you say makes sense in the ways of the world, but God's ways are not our ways. You must not lean on your own understanding. You seem to have a good heart, but the heart is fickle. Faith is about trusting. End quote of what he said. Glennon goes on to write, do not think, do not feel, do not know. Mistrust your own heart and mind and trust us. That is faith. He wanted me to believe that trusting him was trusting God, but he was not my connection to God. My heart and mind were my connections to God. If I shut those down, I'd be trusting the men who led this church instead of trusting God. I'd be relying on their understanding. The thing that gets me thinking and questioning most deeply is a leader who warns me not to think or question. I won't passively outsource my faith and my children's faith to others. I am a mother and I have responsibilities to all children, not just my own. When hate or division is being spread in our religious institutions, we have three choices. 1, remain quiet, which means we agree. 2, loudly challenge power and work like hell to make change. 3, take our families and leave. But there is no more silently disagreeing while poison is being pumped from pulpits and seeping beneath our children's skin. So many parents have come to me and said, my kid told me she's gay. We've been sitting in this church for a decade. How must she have felt hearing what our leaders thought of her and assuming her mother agreed? How do I undo what she heard there? How do I convince her that I never really agreed with any of it and that she's perfect just the way she is? The God memos we get as kids are carved into our hearts. They are hard as hell to buff out. I'm going to take a quick break from the reading to just pretty much comment on some of the things that we've talked before. Here, Glennon first is talking about listening to her heart and intuition, which I'm a huge advocate of on this podcast. But also she talks a lot about specifically this sentence. The God memos we get as kids are carved into our hearts. They are hard as hell to buff out. Now, this got me thinking about many different things, but what stood out to me most is the psychological component of what is described as your subconscious mind. Way past church, when you are told things repeatedly, especially when you are young, your body, your brain, which recognizes patterns, basically saves them in your brain as protection. And sometimes you're not even fully aware of them. It saves it as protection, and it saves it pretty much as believing that this is how it is. A very clear example of how your subconscious mind can work against you would be if your whole life you're told that, for instance, money's a strong one with a lot of people, that having a lot of money makes you a bad person. And it's often referenced with examples of perhaps billionaires, millionaires that are objectively kind of bad people. Your brain starts to take the information and create these patterns of thinking. However, that isn't necessarily true. But trying to unprogram that is extremely, extremely difficult. That being said, and I guess one example, quick tangent, I always think of someone that has a lot of money that's a good person, Oprah, shout out Oprah today. But going back to the conversation, that is what stood out to me, that what you're learning at a young age is very, very difficult to unlearn. Back to the reading, quote, everybody owes it to herself, to her people, to the world, to examine what she's been taught to believe, especially if she's going to choose beliefs that condemn others. She has to ask herself questions like, quote, who benefits from me believing this, end quote. To continue, quote, after that preacher told me to quit thinking, I began thinking harder. I did my research. Turns out the memo he was trying to pass me, a good Christian basis for faith and disapproving of gays and abortions, started being issued only 40 years ago. In 1970, a few rich, powerful, white, outwardly straight men got worried about losing their right to continue racially segregating their private Christian schools and maintaining their tax-exempt status. Those men began to feel their money and power being threatened by the civil rights movement. In order to regain control, they needed to identify an issue that will be emotional and galvanizing enough to unite and politically activate their evangelical followers for the first time. They decided to focus on abortion. Before then, a full 6 years after the Roe v. Wade Supreme Court decision, the prevailing evangelical position was that life began with the baby's first breath, at birth. Most evangelical leaders had been indifferent to the court's decision on Roe, and some were cited supporting the ruling. Not anymore. They wrote a few memos using freshly feigned outrage and rhetoric calling for a holy war to lead the nation back to the moral stance that made America great. They sponsored a meeting of 15,000 pastors called the Religious Roundtable to train pastors on how to convince their congregations to vote for anti-choice, anti-gay candidates. This is how they disseminated the memo down to evangelical ministers who passed it down to pews across America. The memo read, to be aligned with Jesus, to have family values, to be moral, one must be against abortion and gay people and vote for the candidate that is anti-abortion and anti-gay. End quote. Now, this is where we take yet another tangent, because the first time I had read that, which was a couple months ago, I was confused. I was surprised, especially the way she referenced that in the 70s, that was when the church began to adopt the anti-abortion stance. I had assumed it was indefinitely like that. And really just that, I had just assumed that. So hearing that that isn't true was really intriguing to me. So actually this morning, I went in and did some more research to better understand what she was explaining to us. And it works like this. I'm going to link things below that I use to help understand this information. There's an NPR podcast called Throughline that goes through and gives the history of different phenomena. There is one very specifically that came out more recently, which I will link below, about abortion. And specifically, it talks about what Glennon explained in this book. So breaking it down, we're going into actually law today, which is wild because I didn't think we'd get to law on this podcast, but here we are. So it begins like this. Roe versus Wade was the ruling that made abortion legal. That happened in 1973. And the Southern Baptist Convention actually passed resolutions in 1971, 1974, and 1976 that supported the ruling, that said that abortion was okay. However, this is where it gets a little sticky and complex. Now you're probably thinking, okay, but how did things flip if in 73 abortion was legalized and it was supported the years prior and after by the Christian church and evangelicals? Here's the thing. So in 1954, segregation was outlawed. People could no longer have segregated schools. However, where it gets complicated is that the law doesn't always go into effect immediately everywhere. And in 1971, there were schools that were still trying to find loopholes around this ability to segregate. again enters another Supreme Court case called Green versus Conley. In Missouri, there were schools that were trying to find these loopholes that I spoke about. New schools were being created called segregation academies by Christian evangelicals who would teach students. And these schools were tax exempt because of education. However, what happens with this court case is that other people in Missouri were like, hey, that's not cool, but that's still segregation. And it was ruled in this case, Green versus Conley, that any organization engaged in racial discrimination or segregation is not considered by definition a charitable institution. Thus, these schools, these segregation academies, were not allowed to be tax exempt. That means they had to pay the taxes. Now, the schools, were relying on the ability to not have to pay the taxes, so that hurt. But it also ruled that more or less these white spaces, these safe, quote, white spaces, were not allowed. Certain people that had these schools actually started moving into politics. One well-known, his name is Jerry Falwell. He had one of these schools and went on to become a political leader. While all of this is happening, a man named Paul Weyreg, who was a conservative political activist, is trying to grow the Republican Party and was aware that if he could find a way to mobilize all of these white evangelicals, that would be a massive vote for the Republican Party. So he's thinking about how are we going to mobilize these people? Paul ends up deciding that racism isn't enough. It's not enough that's going to make everybody get up, join a party, vote, and be politically active. But one thing that stood out to him that might be enough was abortion, because it is emotional. And a word they use a lot is galvanizing. You can get people to move and activate. At first, a lot of Christian evangelicals, when Roe v. Wade was ruled, weren't necessarily bothered. But Paul started to notice that there was this dis-ease as the years went on surrounding increasing numbers of abortion, not with everybody, but with some. So thus was born this rhetoric. And in 1978, that's when Weyreg started pushing all of this type of conversation that abortion is terrible. It's killing babies. It's, like I said, and I always think pay very close attention to the rhetoric surrounding that. The way it's worded as killing babies. That's an intentional choice. And thus mobilized people, because who was running for president at the time was Ronald Reagan, and Reagan adopted that issue. Thus, we see the idea of single issue voters, which are voters that will only vote distinctly on one issue, like abortion. So somebody that would say, I only vote depending on whether or not they're pro or against abortion. And all of these people vote and help elect Reagan. Thus, it is now a part of the continuation of this belief. That to me is where all of this becomes questionable, because it's thought-provoking. Like I said, it's not so much asking you what to think, but I do believe that it is worth looking into things and questioning a little bit. Hey, wait a minute, this changed. And if you look at it, it seems to not be for the unborn kids as much as it was for political power. Now looking at things from more of a statistical standpoint. One article I found, which again I'm going to link below, on Colorado EDU, talks about how it is speculated that an abortion ban, if Roe v. Wade is overturned, may lead to a 21% increase in pregnancy-related deaths, and among non-Hispanic Black women, an increase in 33% of pregnancy-related deaths. Because it's a heartbreaking statistic, but unfortunately, due to systemic racism, Black women are 3 times as likely to die from pregnancy-related causes. It's likely that there will be an increase in deaths if something like this is overturned. If you hear the weird buzzing in the background, I have no idea what's on right now, so I apologize for that, but I'm going to try to remove it. Now looking at it from a different perspective, which to me is combining kind of a statistical perspective, but also with what I would almost describe as a practical mindset. when we look at raising a kid, it's now speculated that having a kid costs about $1 million. And when I think about $1 million, who doesn't have $1 million? A, me. B, impoverished neighborhoods. And that's a dark joke. But a lot of impoverished neighborhoods are not going to have that money to raise kids. Another thing we see with areas that are impoverished, amongst a lot of other problems, such as not having access to, for instance, fresh food, but we also see a decrease in access to education. And if we take that even a step farther, I think about impoverished areas, even if you have access to be able to go to school up through high school, college can be out of the question. In college was where I learned a lot more about sex education. And more specifically, I learned that abstinence prevention programs that teach girls that the way to not get pregnant is to not have sex, are highly ineffective, that they really do not prevent anything, because it comes down to the fact that whether or not it's an uncomfortable mindset or uncomfortable thought to have, kids are going to have sex. They're just straight up going to have sex. And you telling them just don't doesn't help them not get pregnant as you accepting it and being like condoms. So trailing this now all the way back to that mindset, impoverished neighborhoods likely are going to have a higher increase in rates of pregnancy. And unfortunately, no financial means to be able to have this child. So I always think about, even looking back to this conversation, is who would overturning this law really be affecting, as opposed to perhaps someone that would be fortunate enough to be able to have a child with the financial means and support from a big family structure, which is, again, a whole different conversation, which we're going to slowly move into. Now, moving to a more heated aspect of the conversation is looking at the unfortunate side that, at least in my opinion, that if we were to overturn Roe versus Wade, that would mean any person at risk for dying from a pregnancy would have to go through the pregnancy. And any person that had become impregnated by a rapist would have to go through the pregnancy. Those are two very, very serious aspects of the conversation. The struggle with something like that is a couple different things. One is it's the ethical question of, is a woman who's living, is her life more valuable than something that isn't born? I can't answer that for you, but I have my own thoughts. But the second question, in matters of a woman who is unfortunately raped, is her life not worth, I don't want to say enjoying in a sense, but going through sexual trauma, which happens to 1 in 4 women and men too, but going through that type of sexual trauma is incredibly scarring. It will stay with people for so long. It takes so much to heal from it. And if you have a child out of that experience, probably more than 2 different things, but 2 things come to mind. One, to me, is that that child is a reminder every day of what happened to you. And 2 is that that child will probably be affected by that outcome. Looking at it from, for instance, a mother's perspective of having to have a child that occurred through a rape, I can't even imagine the complexities of that, because there's something to be said for having a child and falling in love with it. And I'm not a mother, so I'll never be able, right now, I won't be able to comment on that. But I think about how difficult that relationship would be. And then looking at it now from the child's perspective, and even trailing this back now to simply an unwanted pregnancy in general. I think about girls that are in college that want to complete their education. I think about somebody that did not want to have a child with a specific person, and it happened and now they don't know what to do. Even in those situations, while it is entirely possible that you could have the child and again fall in love with it, it's happened. But if we look at the other side of the coin, having a kid that you don't want in any type of capacity will cause resentment. And often resentment is also going to cause some form of neglect to the child. Children that are neglected, it's just heartbreaking. I think I could start with that conversation. But even looking at it now from a psychological perspective, neglect for children fosters a lot of different psychological issues. One that stands out to me more specifically, which is a little more of a actually kind of buzzing topic in dating, is the idea of dating someone with NPD, which is narcissistic personality disorder. Now, we could get into that conversation a whole nother day. Long story short, it is a very, very toxic form of dating. It is a very toxic person to date, and it usually centers around a lot of disempowerment for the person that is being abused, whether it's emotionally or physically. A lot of times it is emotionally and can be difficult to understand. That is the same topic that includes things like love bombing, which is overshowering a person in some form of compliments and or gifts, and gaslighting, which is telling somebody that their reality isn't true. These type of relationships, again, take women and men a long time to heal from. Now, it even makes me think, I don't believe she was diagnosed with narcissistic personality disorder, but it makes me think of the Johnny Depp and Amber case. We just saw that type of toxic relationship and are watching it play out. Neglect is one of the different aspects of childhood. There's a couple of things, but that can really foster that type of personality disorder. And perhaps it's a stretch, but to foster a personality disorder that is harming people now, once again, and more than one person, very likely, is it a stretch? Like I said, maybe a little bit, but also it does foster it. And even just back to, again, the very practical, but also ethical dilemma of, do we want kids to come into this world that are unloved? I can't answer that for you. And obviously there are massive, massive stories of people persevering despite that. So that could also be argued. But it is a question that comes up when I think about this topic. And one other thing now, looking at this with the ethics of choice and taking it one step farther in terms of a kid being born, we might think, and I could see a counter argument being, okay, well, a woman has a right to choose. Doesn't that child have a right to choose to be born? Interesting question. Interesting, brings up a lot of thoughts. But I think with that, you could say it like that. But then I think of it from the perspective of, especially if it's a woman that doesn't want to have that kid, is the child choosing to also be neglected? Is the child also choosing to not be loved? It takes it. There's a ton of other questions that come into just being born as opposed to just, straight up being born and having a great life, because it's not like they're choosing this great life for themselves. Now, obviously, you can't ask a fetus in utero that question, but then I think very easily that argument actually can be discredited based on the fact that they'd also then have to choose all these other things that, again, they have no idea about. Trailing back to women that are rape victims having the children of their rapists, is it heavily, heavily enforces rape culture. And rape culture is more or less the victim blaming, that if you get raped, it is your fault. We see it in the form of a lot of different things. We see it with men. And again, some of this now information, by the way, that I'm going to go off of is from UFI, where I learned it. But we see it with men, with the expectation that men always want sex at all hours of the day, that they're supposed to want it. So how could they ever be raped? That's where we see it a lot. But with women, we see it a lot with if she gets raped, what was she wearing? Was she drinking too much? She probably wanted it. There are probably mixed signals. We also see it, another little tidbit, with the idea that women are supposed to say no because men are supposed to chase. And that becomes misconstrued over time, that men are sometimes encouraged to believe that they're supposed to pursue despite being told no. But in terms of getting pregnant, it's the same idea with, it's somehow your fault. And I can't think of any other way of saying it is the woman's fault for getting raped than forcing her to have a child. I'm going to let that just exist exactly how I said it. really quick tangent on rape culture, when I think about it too, it's internalized in everybody. Everybody has some form of internalized misogyny, is the word for it, within them. I have it in myself. I think of it, one clear example would be that I was on a walk the other day and I had my hair down and my makeup done because I think I had an interview that day. Maybe I recorded a podcast. And if you see on my TikTok, I kind of got heated about this, but I had a car slow down right next to me. And I looked over and I just see this man just staring at me, like full on staring for a long enough time for me to be uncomfortable. And now what I said to that, and if you can see it on my TikTok, I said, I'm not stupid. I know that he was checking me out. But when you look at the power dynamic there of a guy in a moving vehicle and me, less than half his size on a walk, that makes me feel like I need to run. Now, the thing with that too is as I left that experience, my brain started going like, gosh, dang it. Like, I guess I wish like my makeup wasn't done. Like, I wish I didn't have my hair down because people don't usually bother me when I don't look all done up. That right there is a sheer example of rape culture internalized in my brain that I'm still trying to unprocess. But I still, in a certain sense, sometimes feed into it because I do think it's protective. Sometimes the ways that I dress when I'm in perhaps a not as safe area. And I don't always have the answers for what to do about that dilemma. And one other thing I want to touch on, if we do make this decision to overturn Roe versus Wade, outlawing abortion doesn't stop abortion. It's not like women aren't going to stop having abortions. It just means that they won't be able to do it as safely. And I think that's really important to keep in mind. It doesn't just erase the issue. It simply just moves the issue, what I would describe as behind doors. There's an article, again, I will link below from the Washington Post, but it describes that it's theorized that if this is banned, women will actually just move to different types of methods and get legal abortions with people that are trained to give them. So it's not necessarily theorized that there's going to be a drastic increase, perhaps in death, but it's not fully known yet. And one thing I will say in terms of looking at a lot of stats to keep in mind with something like abortion, when something's illegal, we're not conducting research on it the same way we are something that's legal. So it's actually really hard to basically figure out if someone had an abortion if it's something they did in secret. I think that's really important to keep in mind as well. Wrapping all of this information together, the conclusion that I make based on looking at A, how this conversation came to be, B, the stats surrounding increased rates of death, C, the dilemma of bringing in kids that are unloved and or the dilemma of allowing a woman's life to be really difficult. My conclusion that I make from this is that really for the benefit of everybody, even if we don't like it, that we have to let people do what they want with their lives. I think it's very plain and simple. What I will say is if you would never get an abortion, of course, great, have the baby. That's fantastic. Children are fucking awesome, all right? That's that. But if you know someone that's in a situation where they feel like they can't go through with it, I struggle to fully understand the belief that, especially in terms of perhaps a very risky pregnancy that could result in death and or rape, but even in areas, like I said, of neglect, I struggle to believe that that can be projected onto somebody else. And like I said, though, it's not my job to tell you what to believe and what to think, but combining this information, that's the best conclusion I could come up with. One other thing that I want to hit on is I think there's a lot of panic surrounding this issue right now. And as is very understood. However, very specific to now Illinois, because that's where I'm podcasting out of, if this topic makes you very nervous, what I will say is I had to cover this last year, actually, for U of I. And one of my friends, shout out Josh, if you're listening, one of my friends is a law student at U of I, and he was able to give me a breakdown of pretty much what would happen if Roe versus Wade was overturned in states like Illinois, for instance, or perhaps California, New York, states that often vote more pro-choice. In Illinois, what happens is that a decision is made at the top. So the Supreme Court can make a decision that's going to be on the national level. But from there, then it has to come down to the states. So Illinois, it is unlikely we would see that flip that I think a lot of people are really afraid of. But I will say that doesn't extend to other states. I mean, we just saw a woman get arrested in Texas for performing an abortion on herself. So it will not be the same everywhere. One other thing that I want to talk about, just in terms of laws surrounding women and female experiences, is something that I got really, really heated about the other day. If you follow me on Instagram, you can see that I posted a lot about it. But one author that I've actually quoted on this podcast multiple times, Rupi Kaur, a very, very famous poet, had her books banned in Texas. And her books were banned on the grounds that it had graphic images and conversations surrounding sexual violence. Because in Rupi's books, in her poetry, she delves into some of that. The thing with it, one, I will first start by saying I have read 2 of her books. It is not graphic. In my opinion, it is not graphic at all. It lightly touches on it, but it is not in a way that is traumatizing or could potentially cause somebody to have any type of PTSD reaction to it. But I said this on Instagram, but when we ban art, any form of it, we ban the very thing that makes us human. We ban a part of our humanity, the essence of it. And art is a way for people to heal. And when we ban things like a book that talks about healing from sexual trauma, we do not open up the ability for any other sexual trauma survivors to heal. And to me, that is disgusting. I think it's horrifying that something that probably helps people heal is being banned. If we don't talk about these conversations surrounding sex in general, whether it is sex itself, whether it is teen pregnancy, whether it is, unfortunately, sexual violence, we cannot create different conversations, but also laws, other types of principles that can protect people in the future. If you don't know about it, how are you going to protect yourself from it? If we look at history, those that don't learn it are often doomed to repeat it. That is how the saying goes. When we ban books, it usually leads to a lot of other negative things that happen. I don't think I even have to reference the main one that comes to mind, but it's not good. And I think it's something just to be very, very aware of. Now, wrapping this all together, like I said, a very deep, deep conversation. Again, I want to say, for the last disclaimer, I don't want to tell you what to think or believe. But what I will say is, if you believe something that is going to affect somebody else as opposed to just affecting you, ask yourself perhaps why. And ask yourself, where did this come from? And past that, I'm a huge advocate. I bring the research to this podcast, so you don't necessarily have to. But start to look things up. Stay curious. I think it's massively important. When we learn things, when we research them, when we learn them for ourselves, that is how we have these empowered conversations and make decisions for the better of everybody else. Even if it's a decision that maybe we don't like or makes us uncomfortable or we wish didn't have to exist. I think it's really important with such a crazy, passionate topic like this that you have conversations with other women and anybody else that could get pregnant, such as people part of the non-binary community. Have these conversations with other people because you will be surprised what you hear. The topic of abortion is massively, massively rooted in shame and shaming women that make choices that they have to. And shame accompanies secrecy. A lot of people that may have had abortions, people you might be super close to, you might not know. They might never have told you. So be open to having these conversations, because when we have conversations with others about perhaps traumatic instances in their lives, we can learn from them, build empathy, understand, and make decisions together, again, for the better of people. So be really open to having those conversations. I've already had some that are insane that I'm not even going to get into it, but I've already had some conversations that were surprising. So I believe that it's really important to have those conversations, be open to it. And like anything in life and with any situation, listen to somebody from a place of no judgment to the absolute best of your ability. All right. To wrap everything up, if you like the conversation that I had today, please give me a follow on Instagram and give me a like for watching this on YouTube. Ooh, YouTube. But that being said, I am Sammi St. Ledger. This is Trust Me, I'm a Novice. We will be back next week. But in the meantime, trust me, because I'm a novice.